And we acknowledge that the land and the labor of the Anoka people, once known by the French as Alena, but by themselves were known as Inoka, whose connection to this land we remember and whose presence and past we respect. As part of the First Unitarian of Alton's mission of supporting and fostering learning through generation and dissemination of knowledge, we acknowledge that the land that we are meeting on today is the original homeland of the Anoka people. We begin our worship this morning with a prelude. An important ritual in the Unitarian Universalist faith is the lighting of our chalice. Hans Deutsch, an Austrian artist, first brought together the chalice and the flame as a Unitarian symbol during his work with the Unitarian Service Committee during World War II. To Deutsch, the image had connotations of sacrifice and love. Unitarian Universalists today have many different interpretations of the flaming chalice, including the light of reason, the warmth of community, and the flame of hope. Please join me in reciting the words, the unison words for the chalice lighting. We hallow together, by kindling the lamp of our Creator. Our opening words come from Hildegard of Bingen and can be found number 493 in the gray hymnal. Fire of the Spirit, life of the lives of creatures, spiral of sanctity, bond of all natures, glow of charity, lights of clarity, taste of sweetness to the fallen, be with us and hear us, composer of all things, joy in the glory, strong honor, be with us and hear us. Now please join me in the first hymn this morning, Come Thou Font of Every Blessing. It's number 126 in the gray hymnal. Come Thou Font of Every Blessing.
Good morning. So as our message today is about the goddess and Jesus and whether those things can go together. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how I see this connecting in with the fourth UU principle, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Today's message is about the historical figure of Jesus and whether or not he can live in the divine feminine, whether or not we can make a connection there. And you may not be interested in Jesus or the goddess, and that's totally okay with me. I'm not here to try to convince you or convert you or anything like that at all. But if you were raised in some form of Christianity, which many people were, or even really just in this country where Christianity is the dominant culture, chances are you might have some baggage with Jesus. Might, just maybe a couple people do, just a little bit. Religious trauma is just abundant in our communities and in this country because of the way that certain messages have been pushed on us and forced upon us. And the church has often wielded an image of Jesus that is this white, male, heteronormative, dominant image, and it's been used to oppress people in so many different ways, so many different communities. So in our exploration today of Jesus and the goddess, I'd like to invite you just into looking of this fourth UU principle, this free and responsible search for truth and meaning. This is a great way for us to be able to explore our own search for what is true for us. What does those concepts mean for you? And it's about giving ourselves permission to take what works for us and leave the rest behind. So you may not want anything to do with Jesus, like I said before, and that is perfectly okay as we move into this topic today. Perfectly okay with me. But for those of us who remain in this swirl of wounding and maybe even some curiosity about Christian upbringing, and who maybe have an interest in dismantling this white Jesus who seems to kind of dominate in our culture, I invite you into this free and responsible search for meaning today with me so we can wander and explore together. My hope is that we might find something healing and liberating together. So I'd like to invite you just into our joys and sorrows ritual today to go ahead and read some of the joys and sorrows that have been shared here. So I've got a concern to be read from Mary Johnson. She said, our daughter-in-law's grandparents live in Kharkiv, Ukraine, where massive fighting and major disruptions are occurring, including the bombing of a major gas line and residential areas. The grandparents are hiding in their basement as they are too elderly to try to leave the country. Our daughter-in-law's mother lives 50 miles away across the border in Russia, but the borders are closed, so she can't go help her parents. Everyone is terrified and wonders whether the Western nations are able to help the Ukrainians. I just want to lift that up. Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us, Mary. I wonder if we might just take a moment together in silence just to honor our siblings in Ukraine. Would you join me in a moment of silence just to meditate in our hearts for the suffering that they're enduring at this time? I've also got a joy to share from Jerry Johnson, who will be celebrating his 80th birthday next Thursday, hopefully in Havana, Cuba. So happy birthday to you, Jerry. Yeah, so excited for you. Are there other joys and sorrows to be shared with the community at this time? Yeah, it's good to be with each other, warm eyes to warm eyes. Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, I'll go ahead and pass it back over to John for our stewardship time.
It is stewardship time, as many of you know. We offer the gentle reminder that this community of faith is supported only by your giving. We need each other, and in times of trial, we need each other even more. I challenge you all to not only consider stewardship to be about financial donations, but also ask people to donate time and talent to help our church. If you can't write a check, can you donate some time to serve the church community? Can you volunteer to help clean the grounds? Can you help make repairs when needed? Can you call housebound members who would appreciate a call now and then to know that we still care? Please donate as you can with your time, talent, and/or treasure. All are needed for the church to thrive. You can mail your financial gift to First Unitarian Church, Post Office Box 494, Alton, Illinois 62002, or you can give electronically by searching for First Unitarian Church of Alton on the Give Liffey app. That's what I do all the time. Or via the link on our webpage. As well, you can give through PayPal if you prefer. If you are willing to donate your time and talent, please contact a board member and let us know what you can do to help. Give what you will and what you are able, for you are a generous people. Please join me now in the offering prayer as we will recite in unison. May this offering equip us to inspire love and seek justice. Yes. Right. Please join now in a hymn to help us center and ground as we prepare for the reading and message. We will sing the 23rd Psalm. Actually, Joy will sing, and then we will listen and reflect as that is being done. It's number 1030 in the blue hymnals.
1038.
1038, sorry. 1038 in the blue. I saw it 1038 and said 1030. So.
Yeah.
1038 in the blue hymnal.
makes me lie down in green meadows beside the still waters. She will lead. She restores my soul. She rights my wrong. She leads me in the path of good things. She fills my heart with song. Even though I walk through a dark and dreary land, there is nothing that can shake me. She has said she won't forsake me. In her hand, she set a table before me in the presence of my foes. She anoints my head with oil and fill my cup overflows. Surely goodness and kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will live in her house forever, forever and ever. Glory be to the Mother and Daughter and to the Holy of Holies, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
So our reading this morning comes from the Christian New Testament, from the book of Mark, chapter 8. Jesus and his disciples went into the villages near Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, "Well, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "And what about you? Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone about him. So, I'm not a Buddhist. As I've made clear with my introduction today, I actually work out of the Christian lineage. But I have to admit that I have a pretty big crush on Buddhism. I'm really into Buddhism. What I've learned of it, what I've been able to soak up, the little morsels of nourishment that I've been able to experience from that tradition have been so nourishing to me. And I have some friends who are avid students of Thich Nhat Hanh and have been mourning. If you're not familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh, he was a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist teacher, a monk, beloved teacher to many people around the world, including the West. I see some heads nodding, so I'm thinking maybe there's some Thich Nhat Hanh fans in the room. And I've been listening to these friends who are mourning the loss of their beloved teacher, who many of them called Thai. And there's this story about Thich Nhat Hanh that I have always loved. He was talking to some of his students in France in the late 1990s who had come to study with him. And they had come to him from various cultures and traditions because they were finding something in his practices of mindfulness that they had not found in their own religious traditions and their own cultures. And they wanted to learn and practice these things because they felt happier and they felt lighter when they did. But what I found so interesting about that, as somebody raised in a Christian culture where often religion is taught to be about converting people and trying to get everybody to be just like me, right? That's how Christianity does it. Thich Nhat Hanh actually encouraged his students to stay in their culture, to stay with their roots, to get to know their own spiritual ancestors, and not to give up who they were, but to reconcile in whatever way they could with their ancestry. He said to his students, "Find the jewels in your own tradition." Now, as somebody who has been hurt by the tradition that I came from, I was raised in Christianity, Roman Catholicism specifically, I know how ridiculous that can sound to say reconcile with your roots and find the jewels in your tradition, because sometimes there is no reconciliation possible. You know, when we've been hurt, sometimes what we need to do is to express our anger and to be able to say, no, like this tradition doesn't work for me anymore. If you are someone who's ever been hurt by a religious tradition or a spiritual tradition, especially if it's been Christianity, let me just say that I am sorry on behalf of my lineage and my tradition for what has been done to you, because it is wrong and it's not your fault and you deserve healing and justice. And I have walked that road myself, so I know it very personally. So while I'm not here to tell you that you need to reconcile with your ancestry, whatever that ancestry is for you, I do think that there's beauty in this invitation to find the jewels. And so today, being from the tradition that I'm from, I want to invite you into some of the jewels that I have found as somebody who has a great love for the divine feminine and has somehow figured out how to walk this path as a Christian feminist. So I invite you into some of these jewels that I found that I would love to share with you. Today's reading might be familiar to you if you were raised in a Christian context or if you're familiar with the New Testament. It's a commonly told story, and it often gets interpreted through a pretty narrow lens. People like to say, you know, Jesus is testing his disciples. He's trying to make sure that they say the right thing, that they profess the right truth, that he is the Christ. There's one interpretation that tends to get said as the way to look at this one. And I think so many people have had this experience, right? There's only one way to think about who Jesus is. He's supposed to be your Lord and Savior, and supposedly if you admit that, if you confess that, that's the only way that you can get saved. And I don't think I have to tell you how traumatizing that can be for people, especially when it's repeated over and over and over again. For some of us, we might be triggered just hearing this story read out loud because our brains have been trained to hear it through the lens of that one narrow perspective of, you know, faith comes as an assent to a particular doctrine. Like that's just been repeated over and over again. But I'd like to offer a different take today. And as somebody who actively works within the Christian lineage to try to heal and repair the damage that has been done, I tend to focus on Jesus' humanity. So when I read this story, I wonder, what if he just genuinely wanted to know, what are people saying about me? He'd been doing a lot of radical things and he was getting a lot of attention. And so it seems pretty reasonable to me that he might wonder what people might be saying. You know, what's the word on the street? I don't know about you, but I've definitely laid awake at night thinking about a Facebook post that I made or an email I sent and wondered, what are people thinking about me? Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, you know? Or do people think I'm crazy? Maybe he was just wondering. Maybe he felt insecure. Is that possible? And I hope that this reframing is just one trail that can lead us into a forest of possibilities of ways that people can actually interpret Jesus. Maybe he's an interesting historical figure. Maybe he's a spiritual ancestor. Maybe he's a brother or a teacher or a conversation partner. Maybe he's a deity that some people like to pray to for guidance and help. Or maybe Jesus isn't someone you want to deal with at all, and that is perfectly okay. I am definitely not here to try to convince you. But I will say that living in a Christian dominant culture, it's worthwhile for us to have a critical understanding of who Jesus was, rooted in the tradition. His name and his image have been used in so many harmful ways, and when we don't have our own counter narrative, that dominant story really wins out. And so as a feminist Christian, I see a particularly liberating path for Jesus in the lineage of the goddess, or as some say, the divine feminine. Now, if you're wondering, whoa, that sounds wild. Isn't Christianity like the most patriarchal religion ever? How could that be possible? I don't blame you, because I can't say I haven't wrestled with the same questions myself, and I still wrestle with them. But my journey inside of Christianity, like a lot of other people, led me to a space of rejection. It led me to a space of needing to walk away. I was raised in Roman Catholicism, like I mentioned earlier, and I experienced a lot of hurt in the church, whether it was related to homophobia, whether it was related to purity culture, or a very negative view of women's leadership. I internalized some of those messages. And I began to associate Jesus with this patriarchal culture that was harmful to me. So, like I said, I walked away and I found God in other places, like the divine feminine, like yoga, meditation, mindfulness, like I mentioned earlier. And I had no interest in dealing with a male God anymore. And that was just fine for me. It was a very important place in my healing journey. And I think a lot of people come to this impasse where they're like, okay, is there any redemptive path inside of Christianity for people who are marginalized in any way, right? For women, for LGBT folks, for lots of people who've been targeted by this stuff. And when so much of the tradition has been covered in this patriarchal violence. And of course, there are people who are in that space of like, no, this doesn't work for me. It's not healing or liberating. I need another path. And that is an awesome place to be. And my journey took me down a little bit of a different path of reclamation and finding these pieces, like Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, like finding the jewels that really are still these vibrant wells of living water, and finding a way to drink from them, and finding a way to be healed from them and to share them with others. And there really is, like, if you're someone who wants to reclaim elements of Christianity, or if you're just curious about whether there's anything there that can be reconciled with feminism, with being a queer person, other parts of who you are, there's a lot of spiritual ancestors backing that up. And I know the church doesn't always want us to know about that, but it's just true. There is this through line, there's this taproot inside of the tradition that crosses centuries all the way through, that's deeply rooted in the divine feminine. So let me tell you a little bit about that taproot. There's Sophia. I don't know if you've heard about Sophia. She is this female deity in the lineage of Judaism. So we hear about her throughout the book of Proverbs, throughout the book of Sirach, the book of Wisdom, if you're familiar with the Hebrew Bible at all. Her name in Hebrew is Chokmah, and in English it gets translated into wisdom. So when you hear about the word wisdom in relation to the Hebrew Bible, you can think Sophia. And she is always personified as this woman of power and wisdom. She is this street preacher who gets in the middle of the busy places of the world and calls out for justice when injustice is being done. She is the tree of life, and she is even portrayed as the giver of all life and all good things. And in the first century, when Jesus lived and walked and knew people and talked, the people around him, many of whom were Jewish, were drawing on their lineage, their spiritual and theological traditions, to try to explain who he was and try to make sense of their relationship with him. And a lot of the communities who knew him and talked about him and eventually wrote about him, described him as a prophet of Sophia. They described him as a child of Sophia, and sometimes even as an embodiment of Sophia herself. And so it wasn't the only metaphor that they used for Jesus, but it is a very powerful and consistent one. It's present throughout the New Testament. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he says, Christ, the power of God, the Sophia of God. We get that in English as the wisdom of God, but it's Sophia right there in the original Greek. And that's not how I was taught to think about Paul in terms of the New Testament. I don't know about you. That was not the Paul that I knew growing up, talking about this mother goddess Sophia. But it's there. It's in the Bible. My favorite passage actually comes from Luke. And Jesus is like talking to these haters. And he's like, oh, come on. He says, John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you said he has a demon. And he says, yet the human one, that's Jesus, came eating and drinking, and you say, look, a glutton and a drunk, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. He's kind of making fun of the people who are hating on him. And he says, but wisdom, Sophia, it would be in the Greek, is proved to be right by all of her descendants. So he's like literally saying, like, Sophia is my mother. And whether, you want to be an ascetic like John and denounce the world, or you want to be like me and eat and drink and hang out with all kinds of people that you people don't like, she's our mom and she loves us both. And that's who we came from. And that's not something I think the church really ever wanted me to know about, to think about in terms of Jesus. So there's this through line, like I was talking about. There's ancient and medieval people who talk about Jesus as a mother. Hippolytus, who was like one of the ancient church fathers, described the sacrament of communion as the breast milk of Christ. This is like one of the most ancient church fathers that we like base all this doctrine off of. Anselm of Canterbury, who was in the medieval times, he was an archbishop. He called Jesus his mother. Julian of Norwich, who was a medieval mystic, also called Jesus her mother. And so when Christians in this century are doing all of this gender binary policing stuff and saying that gender has to look a certain way, it's just not true. This is very new stuff. The long history of Christian tradition shows that there are these elements of gender bending that go through the centuries. So, who do you say that I am? Prophet, child, embodiment of Sophia herself, maybe. And if that imagery works for you, go for it. And if it doesn't work for you, just leave it behind. Another link that people have found from Jesus to the goddess is through his mother. As somebody who was raised in the Catholic Church, Mary's a pretty big deal. And I know Mary can be kind of triggering for me and lots of people because she's often, associated with this idealization of a certain kind of femininity. She's kind of this idealized meek and mild, and she's portrayed as this perfect virgin. But it's kind of interesting because the church had to do all these major theological gymnastics to try to explain why Mary wasn't a goddess, which really just says that people really were worshiping her as a goddess. There's documents that show in the early stages of the church that people really did worship her. And it's just not that hard to see the tiny little step that you have to make from mother of God to mother God. Like it's not that hard of a step to make. And you can see why the church had to work so hard to make sure that people weren't making that connection or to discourage them from making it. And there's some feminists who say that the story of Mary and Jesus is like the story of the ancient goddess Isis and her son Horus, that it was a reimagination of that story. I think it's really, really interesting how Catholics all over the world, especially in countries that have been dominated and colonized by Western Christianity, have found ways to think of Mary as a reimagination of the goddesses who existed in their cultures before they were colonized. So we have Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico, who many people see as a reassertion of the goddess Tonantzin, who was an Aztec goddess before colonization, and she reappeared as Mary so that she could live on and be concealed inside of a culture that wouldn't allow her to be continued and for her to be worshipped. So there are these magical ways that Mary kind of keeps showing up in the world, even when the church tries to push her down. And she shows up in these very radical ways for people. So I got to kind of rein myself in because I'm, coming out of Catholicism, I can talk about Mary and get all hyped up. But so who do you say that I am? Is Jesus a child of the great mother goddess? Maybe. There's lots of reasons that people could see him that way if you want to. Again, if it works for you, take it. If it doesn't, leave it. And the last option I'd like to offer you is just a little bit simpler. It really just kind of comes down to the stories that we know of this person that we call Jesus in the New Testament. And honestly, we kind of tend to think of ourselves with all these identities and labels and titles, but we really know who we are by how we treat other people at the end of the day. Like how we actually interact with others says a lot more about who we are than anything else. And Jesus was a gender-bending feminist in so many ways. He had reciprocal relationships of equality with women. He considered them friends and thought partners, and he broke gender norms of his time. He had empowering relationships with women. He got called out by a woman. If you remember, if any of you know the story of the Syrophoenician woman, or she's known as the Canaanite woman in Matthew, the story about the crumbs under the table. Like, she calls Jesus out, and he's like, whoa, thank you, praise for the way that you have called me to task, sister. I think we can see Jesus as like a male ally, a different kind of masculinity. In the story with the woman caught in adultery, he literally interrupts the male patriarchal violence that's about to happen to this woman and sends all these people home packing and just stands with this woman who's very vulnerable. He's a different kind of masculinity for men and male-presenting people who want to be an accomplice in dismantling patriarchy. So who do you say that I am? For me, I say feminist brother. That's what I would say. And so these are some of the jewels that I have found in my tradition that I have really worked hard to dig deep and dust off and polish. And I've tried to turn them into something beautiful or something workable that people can hold on to. And it's great to share them with you. I think of them, like I said earlier, as like beads on this string that connects us through centuries across time, through this taproot of goodness that has been covered up by a lot of harm. I see them as gems hidden in plain sight by my spiritual ancestors that were left to help me find my way back. And I see us as living in a time where the goddess and the divine feminine doesn't have to hide anymore. Like, she gets to come out from the caves that she's hidden for self-preservation and be available to the world. So for me, reclaiming Jesus and Jesus's connection to the divine feminine is part of that shift in consciousness. It's part of that coming out of the cave of the goddess in our time. So like I said, these are the jewels that I needed to find in my tradition. But just like the text itself, I'm not offering an answer. I'm posing some questions, just as Jesus didn't actually offer an answer about who he was. He asked a question. So I want to know, what jewels have you found in your tradition? Who are your spiritual ancestors, and what gems have you inherited from them? Who do you say that Jesus is on your terms? What is liberating and healing for you? And I'd like to invite just a few minutes of community response. If anybody feels called to answer any of those questions, here with the community at this time. Or if anything else bubbled up for you in response to what I've said that would like to be shared and witnessed by the community. Would it be helpful to pass this down to you?
I had two thoughts. As I was listening to your sermon, as you saw me in the front row, I'm just nodding like heavily. Coming out of the Catholic tradition, I think one of the reasons why I ultimately left at the end of the day is I said, if I wanted to be Pope, I couldn't be. And I didn't understand why. And that bothered me because I was raised to be a strong, opinionated woman, and anybody that knows me knows that's true. And it bothered me. So that's one of the reasons why I needed to take a step back. And then I saw how women, no matter what they did, no matter how they were, how smart they were, how contributing they were to it, that was a problem. So that was the first thought that came in my mind. I remembered that moment for me when I finally said, okay, it's time to turn the switch off and walk away. But the question that came up for me was, and maybe this is a different sermon, but where is the source of the misogyny? Where did that happen, and when did that shift? So that, as much as we could know that in history. So I'm going to pass it back to you.
I love that question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Laura. I think for me, I was also raised in a Christian tradition and embraced it, when I was younger. And eventually I felt shut out by the church. Like it didn't align with how I felt spiritually, the messages that I was getting. But I had a need to connect with the oneness that I feel that runs through all of us. And I didn't know what that was, and it took me obviously years and years and years. But Annie, I really appreciate your questions that you're posing today. Those are giving me a lot of thoughts about Jesus, because what I've thought recently is like, what is it that I get out of the Christian Bible? And I guess I've leaned on 3 words that I thought were true, and that is God, and whatever I feel God is love. It's just one sentence. There's only 3 words in it. And I thought, well, if that's true, then I am love. That's the truth that runs through. And so I still haven't, I still have some things like, well, who was Jesus? I was raised, I got those messages over and over and over again, but that doesn't feel still right to me. What feels right is the connectedness of love that I feel for every other person that I think I am. And so, yeah, so you've given me a lot to think about.
I was raised in a tradition where God was both male and female. We referred to God as Father, Mother God. And one of the readings said, we have no reason for thinking God is masculine more than feminine. So Father, Mother God has always been in my tradition. Christian Science.
When I was about 15 years old, I came from, I don't want to say a traditional Christian family, because we went to church every Sunday, but it was a terribly abusive, oppressive home I lived in, so I never could quite make sense of what was good. But my grandmother, when I was about 15 years old, sent me to read the Bible, because I was to find out what a horrid, immoral person I was. And I didn't read all of the New Testament. I didn't read the Old Testament, but I read a lot of the New Testament. And for years, I had a secret. I liked this Jesus I found. But I knew that Jesus was not my grandmother's Jesus. He got angry. He went to a party, a wedding feast, party, celebration. His kindness to the adulterous woman. There was something through that reading. To this day, I can still remember the day it dawned on me. I said, my grandmother doesn't know this Jesus. And I have tried all the traditional kinds of Christian churches and things over the years. I've tried everything. In Buddhism, I very much resonate with Buddhism. I'm not a Buddhist. I don't live in an ashram. I never have. I never will. But there's something for me, the understanding came as very gentle and kind, has room for everyone, and was I think my draw to Buddhism. And I still do some of their prayers and some of their practices. But still, over all these years, Jesus has remained my buddy. I know that he's just been my friend, and I would giggle things over the years. Pardon? Oh, I'm hearing voices. Oh, okay. Anyway, I just wanted to share that because it's always been a secret. I knew a Jesus my grandmother did not know. And how that happens and why, I don't know. But for years, she would talk about him. I'd think, you don't know who I know. So anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Anybody else want to add?
Thank you so much for sharing. It's really, really good to hear more from people's stories, and I just resonate so much. I saw so many heads nodding, so I see a lot of shared resonance. It's good to just break it open and hear kind of what you've brought into the room. And I love what you said about there's two different Jesuses, you know? And I think a lot of people have kind of used that pathway to sort of say, like, this Jesus, this like sort of white male, straight, dominant, colonizing Jesus is not really the real one. Like, it's a projection of all of these ideologies that have been created over time. Yeah. And so whether you identify as Christian or not, it's empowering to know the difference so that we can, witness to it in the culture that we live in. So anyhow, thank you for engaging in such a wonderful dialogue. And oh, Lord. Okay, here we are. I'm sorry. I'm getting caught up with myself here. I'm so excited hearing what you had to say. I forgot what we have next. I believe we are moving to our final hymn as we leave this friendly place, which is number 414 in the gray hymnal.
We have some announcements this morning. First, these are all announcements from Robin. We served 20 people yesterday at our fourth Saturday distribution. If you're interested, we need volunteers once a month to help with the distribution. Please contact Paula Moore if you are interested. It started many years ago. It kind of evolved from a lunch and then to personal care distribution, so it's been around a long time. So we need volunteers for ushering and coordinating ushers, and we also need nursery volunteers on an ad hoc basis. So if you know responsible young adults who can babysit, we will pay as well too. So as we come back into church, we'll be needing these things: ushers, nursery volunteers. So. Also, there will be a difficult conversations workshop next week after church. Please plan to attend either live or virtual, and this is kind of directed toward our discussions about the building and the future of our church. So please plan to attend if you are interested. Any other announcements that we have? Yeah.
Not too far. I can open up the office to get this quiet, please.
Well, it was mentioned that we could put Easter eggs, hang Easter eggs from it. So.
Why not?
Yeah.
Take down the Christmas ornaments.
The tree is always nice. So. There we go. Now I invite you to join me in reciting a prayer as I extinguish the chalice. The light of truth and meaning cannot be put out. We are keepers of this flame until we meet again.
Our closing words come from Laura Lynn Bellamy and can be found at number 692 in your gray hymnal, if you'd like to read along. If here you have found freedom, take it with you into the world. If you have found comfort, go and share it with others. If you have dreamed dreams, help one another, that they may come true. If you have known love, give some back to a bruised and hurting world. Go in peace.
Yes, I felt privileged to do it with you, so for sure.
Same. Mutual feeling.